Okay, so the next talk is a talk that's going to be divided into three parts. Is going to be on the logistics and the operational side of how the consortiums run. And first up, we have Catherine Ludden.
Good morning, everybody. I am Dr. Catherine Ludden, Director of Operations for COG-UK. First of all, wow, how am I going to follow on from Sharon's talk? But I'll try. I'm going to hopefully bring you along a journey of the SARS-CoV-2 sequencing logistics from a national perspective and really focusing on the hospitals from Pillar 1. And I know that we've got really exciting talks to follow that will talk about the Pillar 2 and the local level. So without further ado, hopefully my journey would involve three components. I'd like to start off at the beginning about how we access samples, following on with how we've driven continued improvements over the last 18 months, and then to really kind of remind everyone and show everyone the journey of how we embed logistics into research and collaborations, which is such an important component for COG-UK. So to start off, I'm going to talk about the cycle of accessing samples. And I've chosen to start on this because I believe it's one of the most fundamental steps to sequencing. You need the samples in order to sequence. And it hasn't been an easy journey, and it's involved many people in this room online to really work together to get these samples. And I'm so grateful to everyone, and in particular the COG logistics team, who worked extremely long hours to get these samples to make this all possible. So to start off, the first step is to identify who's actually doing the testing. And there's various ways to do this. Firstly is we may just know a testing lab who's doing it. We've been informed by COG-UK PIs and lab directors that they know if a lab is doing testing, but there was also many labs where we didn't know if they were doing testing. And this involved us trailing through lab manuals online, seeing if they listed that they were doing COVID-19, so SARS-CoV-2 testing. If they were listed as doing testing, who were they receiving samples from? And if they weren't listed as doing testing, who were they sending samples to? So as you can imagine, this had a very big database of hospitals who were doing testing, and who was sending them elsewhere. And this continued to be updated. More and more labs started doing testing, so it meant that we had to keep checking who was doing testing so we could try to get as many samples as possible from as many regions as possible. Then it came to actually figuring out who to contact. Once we found a testing lab, sometimes we had a point of contact given to us by the COG PI or a partner in the network. Sometimes the contact was listed in the lab handbooks. Sometimes it involved trailing through the internet to try find a point of contact. And if we were lucky, we got one. Sometimes we didn't, and it meant that we had to contact everyone we knew essentially in the network to see, do you know someone that can speak to us about getting samples? And not just do you know the person, but can you give us an email or a phone number? And hopefully more than one. And for anyone who can reflect back on March 2020, it was a very busy time for people in the NHS labs. People were inundated with requests to do testing. There was shortage of staff, reagents, and the priority was testing and not sequencing. So we managed through a lot of hard work by everyone in goodwill to try to get people on the phone. This was either a lot of Zoom calls to introduce COG-UK, but really to build that trust of why sequencing was so important and why we needed to work together. And we acknowledged the restraints that they were under, with having to do the testing, but really to kind of show them the vision that we had of why we needed to sequence. And I think now it's quite evident on why sequencing was so important. Back in March 2020, people were not really doing sequencing worldwide. So getting people to send samples when they were so busy testing was quite challenging. And I think just a massive thank you to those NHS sites and who were extremely busy, but took those phone calls and took those Zoom calls to talk to people from COG-UK and came along with that journey. And once we had them on board and got them, excited about the potential of what sequencing could bring, we had to explain the dreaded metadata process. And I think many people will be familiar with this process and your response of how it goes down. And I think it's about, the way I remember it is that doing Zoom calls and sharing screens to say, these are the fields that are mandatory, this is what you fit in. And having a lot of emails explaining about why we needed the metadata, what we were going to do with the metadata. And then once they agreed to send samples and send the metadata, then we would start collecting more information on what sample types they had available. Again, the sample types changed over the last 18 months. We had some labs doing RNA as a final sample, some had primary, we also have people doing point of care testing. And this is quite important information to gather because depending on the sample type would decide how we would match up a testing laboratory with a sequencing laboratory. And this information actually was very important as time went on because we fed back to various PHE technical groups on the importance of getting a good sample type in order to get good sequence data. And of course, the sample type went on to decide what carrier we use. Now, unfortunately, a rocket wasn't available, which would have been ideal. So we tried to find a solution that worked, that was reliable and also suitable. And when I talk about reliable and suitable, I mean one that can transport those various different sample types. For example, if it's RNA, could they have dry ice? But could they provide an equitable service across the UK? Could we get samples from everywhere across the UK and deliver it point to point in a fairly rapid speed to ensure that we do the sequencing, one that was affordable, and lastly, one that we could get on the university system quick enough so we could start shipping those samples around the country to really having that rapid response that Sharon talked about. And on the side of all of this onboarding hospitals, we were responding to rapid, urgent inquiries. And these were either responses to outbreaks or transmission events or to bulk or VUI investigations. So we would get a phone call or an email saying we urgently need these samples picked up from a certain location and sent to a lab and sequenced within 72 hours. And this was a very different process because it was all about speed. We had to reach out to the COG-UK PIs, many of them are here today or online, and say who has capacity to do this and who has staff that may be able to come in at the weekend, which was not a small thing to ask. And this was a cyclic process that went on over and over for about 18 months. And as Sharon mentioned, and as people will know, we managed to onboard over 100 NHS testing laboratories from across the UK. And just to remind everyone that there was a hands in the middle because it required a lot of working and a bit of begging, but really kind of saying why we're doing this. And it was done over and over. But that's not where we stopped. We didn't just want to bring in a hospital and send samples for testing. We wanted to drive improvements. And a common question we got asked was, how good are you doing? You know, what's your coverage across the UK? And of course, the easiest way to show our coverage is to be able to have the data, to show as a map and to have some metrics. So COG-UK developed a COG-UK sequencing coverage report, and this was from the 4 nations, and it showed how many cases were we sequencing in each region of the UK. And this was produced weekly. And the way this feeds into the logistics was that each week we would look at what areas have either dropped coverage or were below a certain level of threshold. So ideally we would want 10% coverage, and anyone who was below 10% of region, we would look at what hospitals were in those regions. And then we would kick off the action again, contacting those hospitals. If they were onboarded, to inquire why they weren't sending samples, did they change their diagnostic testing, and kind of re-educating the importance of sending samples for sequencing and the importance of sending samples that were going to yield good data. And following on from that was monitoring turnaround times. And when I talk about turnaround times, I really mean the end-to-end turnaround time. Many people will know that the sequencing can be done quite quickly, but actually a lot of the delay can come from getting the samples or getting the metadata to come with the samples. So each week, in addition to monitoring the coverage of the country, we would monitor the turnaround time. And if we would notice that a turnaround time had dropped for a certain area or for a certain hospital, we would reach out to those hospitals to understand why samples weren't being sent or why they were being sent in a shorter, taking longer to be sent. We also worked on increasing capacity through additional funding. We provided extra equipment to the COG-UK sequencing sites and funding for staff to drive up our capacity. And then, of course, to work on the consumables. Many people will know that there was access to certain consumables like gold dust, in particular tips, anything plastic. And I hear some laughter in the room here because people are probably very familiar with this from your own labs. And we really had to drive as a logistics team the importance to various senior leaders and to various networks about how COG-UK was now at the front base of the public health response. And in order for us to do sequencing, we needed consumables. So we worked a lot with NHS Test and Trace and DHSC to get COG-UK sequencing site PIs on the priority list for consumables. So we worked very hard on that, and we thankfully managed to be on the priority list and get access to consumables. Wasn't perfect, everybody was fighting for it, but again was an important step for the logistics team to monitor what consumables were being harder to get, and also looking for additional suppliers. The other next step was to improve the metadata. As I mentioned, in turnaround times, there's one thing sequencing, but if you don't have the metadata, it can't be uploaded to CLIME. This involved a lot of, again, phoning the sites, following up with NHS sites to understand why we weren't getting metadata, how it was taking so long. Was there different ways we could improve getting those metadata? And then really working with the data working group to say, these are the challenges the hospitals we faced with. How can we improve it to really kind of make sure that we get the data uploaded as quickly as possible, bearing in mind the challenges from end to end. Next, we would work on communication between stakeholders. As Sharon mentioned, there's over 600 people in the COG-UK network, so stakeholders is quite a broad term. But we worked on the attitude that everybody's opinion mattered towards continual improvements. So we worked a lot with working with the public health agencies to see, was there areas that they needed improved? Were they getting the sequencing data back for their high priority samples? Were the COG-UK PIs getting access to what they needed, and kind of get everyone to work together to drive those improvements needed. And lastly, updating our funders on progress, risks, and prioritization for sequencing. The last key pillar I'd like to focus on is research and collaboration. And this was a key pillar for COG-UK logistics. Firstly, we shared their lessons learned with national and international partners. What did we learn from COG-UK logistics? We arranged internal seminars to ensure that we were continuing to improve, but also bringing people together. We worked with various studies to share biological materials, such as vaccine studies. The sharing of data for research studies. There was various core national research studies that we work with. We needed to ensure that they were getting the data back. And if they weren't getting the data back, why? Was it an issue that they were labeled in an incorrect way? And if it was, how could we make those changes to ensure that those samples were delivered to the research studies? And lastly, to identify gaps in the research studies. And I couldn't leave this talk without really kind of reminding everybody that this was a team approach. There's over 600 people in the consortium list at the moment, and this is only faces of a few. But without everybody working together, this really would not have been possible. So just a really big thank you to everyone. And I'm very proud to be standing up here today talking about our achievements, and I look forward to the day ahead. So thank you all very much.
Thanks, Catherine. We're going to hold, if there are any questions, maybe if you've got time at the end of the session, and we can ask them for all three. But the next speaker in this talk is Cristina Ariani, who's going to talk about their work at the Sanger with Pillar 2.
Thank you, Andy. I feel, I don't know if you've ever gone, to the streets and met a celebrity. I was once in Liverpool and I saw Anthony Hopkins. And today I feel kind of this way because there are so many people that I've only seen on the screen, including people from Sanger, David Jackson. I had never seen him before in the flesh. And we talk nearly every day, James as well, and many of you as well. So it's an interesting experience, I have to say. And at the same time, it feels so normal and so weird. So it's lovely. Thank you so much. So thank you so much for the introduction from Sharon and Catherine. And even though Sanger has started with Pillar 1 as well, I'm going to focus primarily on Pillar 2. And by the way, can you hear me okay at the back? Okay, thank you. So just a very brief disclaimer, everything I'm going to talk about today is of Senga's view and is not part of the HSCs or the health security agencies. So what have we done so far? What's our COVID operation so far? We have handled 20 million samples. Obviously, that includes negatives and positives. We have currently a capacity to sequence 50,000 samples. We have reported more than 400,000 variants of concern to the UK government. And as of the 11th of October, Senga has uploaded to Climb just under 800,000 samples. And the COG, as you know, according to the Senga website, I think our numbers differ a little bit, but it doesn't matter because it's more than 1 million samples. So it's a brilliant achievement of all of us. And at Senga, we have had more than 300 staff working on that so far. But even though these numbers look very, very large, this is how we started. And I think this is a common ground for many of us in this talk, because we started very small with a bright idea, each of us with our own groups and as well as a consortium as a whole, but it all started small and it became such a huge thing. And in Senga's case, it started at one of our buildings we just posted on the wall. So at Senga, we call it Project Heron. I suppose that each of us will have our own localized project, and at Senga, it's called Project Heron. And I believe that the aim and the objective of Project Heron is common to most of us in this room, which is high throughput genomic monitoring of SARS-CoV-2 in the UK, aiding public health officials in their response to the coronavirus pandemic. And also the aim is to monitor the virus for genetic mutations, which could have public health implications. So I think this is a very common objective throughout this consortium, of course. And from going to those post-it notes to where we are now, we had to build a lot of different things at Senga, starting with sample storage. So if you go to Senga, you'll see that there are 5 very large refrigerated containers sitting in the car park, where there are a capacity to store more than 2 million samples. Thankfully, to Bart's team, the reefers are not full anymore, so we keep it there for contingency, but essentially we could have stored 10 million samples there. We also have new dedicated labs. We have a great contingency from the lab here, if you need to talk to them about anything lab related. But we've been really lucky to have been able to build 2 new lab dedicated to COVID. In one of the in the lab, we have 2 different robotics platforms. One, we have 4 Beckman robots and 2 Biosero arms, which work with Hamilton robots. And even though this would allow us to have a much greater capacity, the idea of having 2 platforms running together is for resilience and redundancy. As Catherine says, there is global shortages of supplies, which I'm going to talk about it, and it's a common ground, I'm sure, that we all face in these days. And we have 7 Illumina Nova 6 dedicated for our COVID operations on Project Heron. So very briefly, what is the process? How do we get this? So we started with the lighthouse. Well, we do work with the lighthouses, and it started by simply getting their waste. And their waste became a very precious waste for us, because this is how enable us to do the work that we do. So they provide us the whole nucleic acid, and it's definitely no longer a waste. From 9 different labs across the UK, as you can see on the map there. They are shipped to us at Senga on a daily basis, and it should arrive at Senga at a certain amount of time, in a certain time of the day, along with some data. This is an overly simplified process that we can go through many days of the entirely. Alan can go through it in a lot of details if you need. But once the samples are at Senga, we'll have the opportunity to use intelligent decision making as to whether we want to sequence a sample or not. I'm going to talk a little bit more about it, but now we have an algorithm that allows us to process some prioritize samples. And also we can select samples that are high CT, that we can select samples that are low CT values. So you can make informed decisions on what samples will be selected for sequencing or not. Then we move on to library prep sequencing, upload to CLIMB, and then in parallel, we report everything that all of our findings to DHSC on a daily basis. And what's our journey from the post-it notes to now? Oh, this got a little bit, never mind. So there was a PowerPoint translation. So essentially we went from, in April 2020, from 600 samples to now in September 2021, to being able to sequence 50,000 samples. We are not sequencing 50,000 samples because of global shortage of supplies, which I think is going to be something that we're going to hear tonight, a little bit more. But tonight's not. Today is the morning. I'm already thinking about the wine. That's all. So, and also we managed to not just to increase the number of samples that we produce, but we managed to reduce turnaround time considerably from 26 days to 5 days now. And also the failure rate from, it used to be 30% there to about between 15 to 20% now. So it's a great achievement, I think. The same idea, but in a bit of more numbers, some more numbers for you. So this is how we started. In orange is the number of samples sequenced, and in blue is Senga's capacity, which have kept going up as time progressed. We are now at 50,000. As you see, we are not sequencing 50,000 because of shortage of supplies. By the end of November, we should have capacity to process 64,000, depending on the supply chain. So now is just putting this all in context. That's fine. We can sequence 40,000. We've been sequencing 40,000, but what does that mean? We actually, in green, is how many samples we are receiving on a weekly basis. And as you can see, it's far beyond what we can actually process. And in between November and January, we were very lucky to work together with Catherine, Beth, and Teresa to send a lot of the samples, the surplus samples from Senga to other COG sites. So thank you very much for all the COG sites that contributed, that were able to sequence an additional 25,000 samples during these days. And there I say, that was the ego time. If you remember, that was a dangerous, they give me the goosebumps whenever I remember of these times, that they were hard. But again, COG-UK stood up really, really great. Beth and Teresa, I'm sure, and Alan, we went through so much together, and Bart's team and everybody really to get another additional 10,000 samples to COG sites for sequencing. So thank you so much. And now, even though we are receiving far more samples than we are able to process, we now have the algorithm that can inform us of what samples to prioritize and what samples to select. Here I show a map of last week's samples, the distribution of the samples that Senga has sequenced. As you can see now, we are ensuring as equal representation as we can of the map. Each dot is not one sample, each dot can be multiple samples, but for visualization, that's how we decided to have the approach. So we can both have geographical distribution, and we can also preferentially select specific samples, for example, care homes, or red, amber, and green traveler samples. Obviously, there's policy change, and this can be changed according to policy. And well, the whole of the team of Senga that has been involved in this have a huge contribution to this journey of improvement, which I think is a major achievement as well. So we've been able to, go down to turnaround times, because that's what we want to do, have the data as real time as possible. So at the moment, as you can see, dark blue is the time for the sample's arrival at Senga, has reduced, is now 1.5 days more or less. Then there's the time for cherry picking and library prep, which is about 1.7 days, sequencing 1 day, and QC is another half day. So from the moment that the test result is published to the upload to CLIMB, it's been about 5 days, give or take. So I think it's a great improvement, and I'm very proud of this piece, because it it was only possible because all of the teams at Sanger were involved into tackling this. Jeff Barrett's team have produced this website, which I personally think is brilliant. It shows the incidence proportion R, and then you can plot things like this and see very clearly the trend of not just the Delta variant, but you can see the Alpha variant. And at that time, I was one of these ones that were checking it every day just to see how it was looking. And it's a sad thing, I know, but I really like that website. So what are the challenges? The challenges are many. And again, I will have to repeat myself. The main challenge is global shortage of supply at the moment. Today, Sarah sent an email saying the IDT Talk Plays arrived, and it's like, oh, brilliant. But it's only for next 2 weeks only. It's like, oh, but we'll get there. So another challenge is the constantly changing landscape. Now things seems to be a little bit more stable, but at the Eagle time, particularly there, I say, it was extremely challenging. Logistics, as Catherine said, getting everything together, we are in a much easier position than Catherine because we only had to deal with 9 labs, but these 9 labs, is a lot to make sure that they are working. A lot of samples, very large teams, a lot of external dependencies as well, because we are all part of a big team, so we need to work together on this. And the timeliness of the outcome. So we need everything to be done as quickly as possible, as perfect as possible as well. We need to manage expectations. I receive emails constantly. I need this sample to be sequenced. I need that sample to be sequenced, but we have limited capacity, even though it's a lot, it's still limited. So we need to manage expectations. And again, prioritization of samples. There was a time of the outbreaks that Catherine and I were with PAG talking a lot about outbreaks, this OB, and we knew as well all the outbreaks happening, Eagle project, and now samples of interest. So it was a challenge to have that build, but now it's built, and I think it's working really well. Internal and external reporting is a major challenge because we didn't have a way to track samples internally at Sanger, so we had to build a report from scratch, the same for external reporting. And I'm sure a lot of us have had that staff having to self-isolate. And we have had floods, we have had fires, and a lot of sweat and tears. But well, we do laugh, we do, yeah. Lessons learned. I think it's a common ground as well. We developed a really good relationship across all parts, and this consortium is a testimony of that so many different parts have worked together. Do not focus on targets. If Lee Walker is listening to it, he's going to be very proud. So do not focus on targets, but just improvement and perfection. So we'll get better results this way. And work really hard creating a single view of the process throughout the performance data. So everybody being involved in the performance. And things will happen, a lot will happen, but just crack on and move on and seek improvement again. And we've gone through a lot of this. IT facilities, HR, and all the core bits of the science is also very important for large-scale genomic sequencing. And recruit lab leaders, there are many here that are used to high-throughput labs, and they are absolutely brilliant. And we are really happy to have, it's a big Sanger contingency there. We need to develop more capacity than we need, as I said, because of global shortages of supplies. So, sorry, I sound like a broken record, but that's true. We need to look at the data QC because it's a crucial part of the process. And there's the difficulties of the constant change in landscape. But I think it's the same time as it's challenging, it's also the beauty of it, because if it gets too, it keeps us going this way. So this, I think, is the most difficult of all of the slides, because it's just absolutely impossible to acknowledge everybody. There's a huge amount of people involved, from COG, from the lighthouses, from the HSC, from PG, from PHS, from Sanger. But being very unfair, I put some names there, and I really wanted to say thank you so much for everything, and I'm really proud of being part of, not just from Sanger, but part of the consortium as a whole. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cristina. We're running a little bit behind time, so we're going to just move straight into the next part of this talk, if that's okay. We did engineer long coffee breaks, so please don't worry, there is still plenty of time for mixing and meeting people you've not met previously, but have worked with for 18 months. So the next part of this talk is from Sam Robson from University of Portsmouth. So take it away.
Thanks, Andy. I was going to slightly cheat and bring my bingo sheet up and say the last word, but actually Catherine's done the job for me, so bingo. So yeah, we've heard some amazing talks from Cristina and from Catherine about the huge amount of logistics that have gone into the COG-UK consortium. I was asked to come along and speak a bit more at a sort of boots on the ground level. So Portsmouth is one of the smaller, possibly even the smallest hub in the consortium. So I was just going to give you a bit of an outline of kind of what we went through, how we got involved with the consortium and what it's been like over in the Portsmouth hubs. So like many universities, we work very closely with our local hospital trust, Portsmouth Hospital Trust, and recently they were awarded university status, thanks to strategic partnership with the university. So we have very, very good links, particularly with Dr. Sharon Glacier over there in the Translational Research Lab. So when I was informed that the labs are being shut down, as we came to the first lockdown, I was told the labs will be shut and you probably won't get in for a very, very long time. Recently, I'd read about the Arctic Protocol and I'd had a conversation with Sharon just the previous day to say, oh, is this something that would be of use to the hospital? You know, could we come in, have a look at some of the cases in the hospital and help you with your infection control? So as soon as I was told that the labs were being shut, I phoned Sharon up with about 2 hours to go before the doors were locked, ran around the lab, grabbing everything I could. I grabbed sequencers, laptops, computers, boxes of reagents, threw them in my car and drove them down to the hospital, luckily not too far. Dumped them in her lab on a Friday afternoon with the people desperately locking doors behind me as I go, and said, okay, see you next week, we'll try and sort this out, I guess. So the following week on the Monday, I contacted faculty at the university. I said, you know, this is what we're thinking of doing. They offered to give us some seed funding to get going, to get us started with working with them. We did our research ethics, which we got done in about 2 weeks, which given previous it's taken 6 months plus, I was absolutely astounded by. That was amazing. And we set up what we called the sequencing and tracking of phylogeny in COVID-19 study, because you've got to spend a lot of time coming up with a really good acronym for these things. Of course, I was very annoyed when then there was another Stop COVID-19 study that came out of Dundee that has a much better website than we've got. But just for the record, I want to make it clear that ours was registered before theirs was. So I'm going to leave it there. But this was us working on our very first run in Sharon's lab. So this is Angie, who's here as well, and Sharon working on our first run. And yeah, we were quite excited to be sort of having an impact on things. So my wife is a respiratory physiotherapist. She works on the high care ward, so she was very much in the thick of this. So Sharon was saying earlier about the real impact of what we're looking at. I was very aware of what was going on in the hospital with my wife working very closely with the very poorly people. So it was a great opportunity from my side to feel like I was able to use my expertise to have an impact on what was going on. And it was around that time that I'd heard about talks that people were having about the COG-UK consortium, and I think I sent Sharon an email saying, oh, hi, we're doing a little bit of this at our local hospital. It'd be great if we could keep, you know, if we could hear about what's going on with the COG-UK consortium so that we can have a think about how we can affect. Anyway, no, all of a sudden we're the South Coast sequencing hub. I think we ended up taking samples from, I think regularly we were working closely with about 10 or 11 NHS trusts across the South and the Southeast, also with Pillar 2 sites who were sending samples around the network, but then also with smaller sites as well. We worked with sites in the Falkland Islands, in Gibraltar, in various army barracks in the local area, basically working with anyone we could and working really hard to increase our capacity to be able to deal with the numbers coming through, because obviously every week there's an ask for more and more samples. So we were doing everything that we could to say, yes, we can definitely help out in whatever way we can. So you can see there that we went from running about 24 samples a week at the start of things to running nearly 1,000 samples a week when we got through the Christmas period and beyond. And I think Sharon's already mentioned this. this is how it felt. And I think everyone can probably say the same thing. I'm sure everyone's used the same analogy at some point, that we were just building things as we went along. And that was absolutely true of trying to build pipelines, trying to make sure that they worked. And in particular with patching pipelines, like my pipelines for this project are held together by sellotape and hopes and dreams. And Jeff Barrett posted this on Slack the other day, and I think this is absolutely true, and probably definitely with my pipelines, hopefully less so with Climb. I think that's one of the huge benefits that we've got within the project. So just to give a sort of brief idea of what our workflow looks like, we've sort of tried to break it down a little bit. It developed massively over time as we tried to deal with everything, tried to work out how best to take more samples whilst also avoiding issues that come with dealing with higher proportions of samples. So every Monday morning we'd have a huddle, a team huddle, to get together to say, you know, these are the samples to expect this week. And I'd usually come along and go, oh yeah, by the way, I said that we'll take another 500 next week. So be ready for that. So the team usually hated me at those times, but we got through it. They still speak to me. We used a lot of sort of tick lists for when people were doing their library prep, so that they could always follow along. All of our aliquots had unique IDs assigned to them, so that if there were problems, if we had contamination, anything along those lines, we could always trace things back and try and identify where the problems were and try and solve them. We used WhatsApp quite a lot. We found it incredibly useful to stay in direct contact with the sites who were sending us samples. So had very good relationships with all of the different sites that were sending us samples. We set up WhatsApp groups for each individual one just to say, we have sent samples, so that we could say we have received samples. And if those two things don't happen, we can work out what's happened in between. The workflow itself, we split up into two groups. Typically speaking, we'd receive our samples in the afternoon, and that's when we'd do our RT-PCR ready for the next day. The following day, a second team, so that it's sort of split between the two teams, would be running our library preps, typically with at least 2 people running on that, because there's a lot of pipetting involved. We don't have robotics. I was very, very jealous seeing Christina's talk about the benefits of doing things with robotics. When we started, it was all single pipettes. I think, Angie, how you didn't end up with carpal tunnel syndrome or something through that. But obviously developed that with multi-channels, which made it a little bit better, but definitely multi-channels are the way forward, robotics are the way forward. We kept things in different labs to try and avoid contamination and using separate hoods and not, you know, never letting the two processes meet each other. And then the analysis, I've written LIMS. I mean, it's not, you know, it's databases that I wrote to sort of hold things together as best as I could. I think calling it a LIMS is a little bit of a stretch. A lot of Google Docs. I know everyone here loves a Google Doc, a Google Sheet. We use a lot of those to try and keep things, you know, between the different sites that we're working. Mainly, all our analysis was done with the Arctic Field Bioinformatics Toolkit, but with various databases and Perl scripts and anything to hold it together, particularly when the Hopi project came along and completely threw everything out and I had to completely redesign everything from scratch. That was fun. And also I used a lot of auto-generated reports, which I found really, really useful. So I used R Markdown to sort of create run reports, to create reports that on a weekly basis we'd send back to our submitting trusts, with a lot of different photos, a lot of different images to help them with their infection control procedures. So looking at clustering within the hospitals of samples that were recently taken, and anything to help them that they could go back and help inform their infection control teams about what's going on in the hospital. And obviously we use civics for very direct looking at outbreaks on the hospital wards. So lessons learned, I mean, Cristina gave a really nice outline, and I agree with everything she said there. So I'll try not to go over what she's already said, but one thing we learned is redundancy, very, very key. You know, if you've got the worry that people are going to get sick, particularly with COVID, you don't want your entire team to suddenly disappear and have nobody to work in the labs, or God forbid they take holiday. We didn't have any of that. But one thing I would say, you know, within the group, I'm very much the bioinformatician. We didn't have a huge amount of bioinformatics expertise. So I was slightly terrified that I was going to be hit by a car and the whole thing would come to a crashing halt. Luckily, I can relax now. I can get hit by a car anytime. It's all absolutely fine. The metadata, everyone loved Metadata Friday. Who didn't love a Metadata Friday? But we tried to make it as straightforward as possible for the people that were filling it in on a regular basis, particularly around really, you know, having to deal with all the huge number of people ill at hospitals. The last thing people in the trust would want to be doing is spending all of their time filling in metadata sheets only to find out we need them to change it. So we tried to sort of keep things as straightforward as possible with drop-down menus and things like that, rather than people typing stuff in. The communications, as I said, we found really, really useful to be in direct conversations with the submitting sites so that we knew exactly where samples were at any one time. Get a robot. I wish we could. We didn't. There we go. We found 96 well plates. So right from the start, because we were taking RNA rather than swabs or primary samples, we always asked for it to come in 96 well plates. And that was probably one of the best things that we did from the start. And all the sites were very, very happy to do that for us. It just made our life significantly easier than rooting around through boxes filled with hundreds and hundreds of tubes. Obviously not always possible, but where possible, that made a huge difference. And yeah, as I say, everybody loves a Google Sheet. Who doesn't? We all love filling those in regularly. Catherine would send them out to us. My favorite time of the day. But I think the important thing, and this has been said already, you know, COG-UK has worked. It has definitely had a huge impact during the pandemic. I completely agree. This is the greatest thing I've ever done, and I've been so proud to have been a part of it and to have had an impact throughout the pandemic. But it's really been that collegiate atmosphere and everybody's goodwill in putting in the time, putting in the difficult time, dealing with the problems, and just putting everything they can in to help the country out and to help the UK and the world in understanding this virus. And you know, that's from everybody. That's from people in the labs, bioinformaticians, people making sure that the climb is up and running, people dealing with the logistics, everybody in the hospitals, everybody in the working on the wards. Everybody involved in this project has made it work. So I'll just finish up there because I think, am I holding everybody up from going to coffee? Yeah, so just to say huge thank you to absolutely everybody involved with this. We couldn't have done it without everybody here. So I've tried to get some photos of everybody within the team. That is a small child. Just to be clear, like many people, I was homeschooling because my wife was in the hospital every day. I was homeschooling my daughter throughout everything, setting all this up, which was great fun. In the end, I just took her to work with me. It was just far easier. So she's been involved. So she's very proud now that all three of us in the family, we've all had an impact on the pandemic. She's come in and worked on some of the COVID samples. So very, very proud. And also, I'm glad to see that the what were they called? The mission patches came in because we designed our own mission patch as well. So we've joined the club on the mission patches. And yeah, and really there's no way of saying thank you to absolutely everybody involved. I've tried to put everybody's names on here. I'm sure I've missed somebody somewhere, which I'm very sorry about. I really am incredibly proud of everybody. And thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing the COG-UK spirit in sort of 7 to 8 minutes. Yeah. I think this has been great. And thank you so much for Catherine and Cristina for sharing your perspectives and for your great talks.